Hi friends, welcome to lesson 26, Subaltern and Feminist Perspective. The word subaltern means the general attribute of subordination which is expressed in terms of a caste, class, age, gender, office or any other way. It includes the characteristics of defiance and submission. Britannica Encyclopedia defines feminism as the belief in social, economic and political equality of the sexes or gender. Although largely originating in the West, feminism is manifested worldwide and is represented by various institutions committed to activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. In the debates on perspectives of development, both subaltern and feminist offer diversified yet interrelated explanations. Objectives of this lesson. After completion of this lesson, dear students, you will be able to understand about subaltern perspective. You will be able to analyze the significance of feminist perspective with regard to development. Subaltern perspective. Subaltern as a concept is best understood as related to the issues of domination and power, democracy and citizenship, resistance and transformation. The term subaltern was coined by Antonio Gramsci. This term describes the political and historical dynamics of subordinated social classes. For example, groups such as slaves, peasants, religious groups, women, different races and the proletariat or working class have been categorized as subaltern social groups. For Gramsci, the ultimate goal was to transform the subordination of subaltern social groups through writing and analyzing the histories of different subaltern groups and contributing to the development of historical understandings of potential strategies for such transformation. During his time in prison, he developed the outline of such understandings, always starting from historical analysis, stressing explicitly the crucial necessity of broad alliances of subaltern groups and the need for developing new conception of cultural values, social relations and state that transcend the hegemonic or the dominating legitimizations of existing domination in order for a post-subaltern state. According to 𝗂𝗽 𝗧𝗧 𝗵𝗃, subalternity is a position without identity, a position where the social lines of mobility being elsewhere do not permit the formation of a recognizable basis of action. 𝗂𝗽 𝗵𝗃 asserts that the subaltern subject is heterogeneous, and by examining the mechanisms of the supposed recovery of their voice, instead an ongoing displacement and effacement is revealed. It is significant to remember that subaltern groups development only can facilitate an inclusive development. B.K. Nagla writes in Indian Sociological Thought, published in 2008, that the subaltern perspective conveys view from below, that is, a view or understanding from the bottom of society, that is, from those who are subordinated, underprivileged, dejected and oppressed. With specific reference to India, Dalits, women, tribal communities, etc., are part of subaltern group and have made their own history over a period of time. The subaltern studies which emerged in India as a post-colonial theory is mostly credited to Ranjit Guha and his colleagues such as Partha Chatterjee, David Hardiman, Shahid Amin, Gyanendra Pandey, David Arnold, Sumit Sarkar and Deepesh Chakravarti. The basic premise of the subaltern perspective is to focus on the development of marginalized, including peasants, tribals. Thus, subaltern approach in studying the peasants and tribal movements in India is an important milestone because it examines the politics of the people and in opposition to the politics of the elites. David Hardiman examined the role of local peasants' activities and Adivasi, that is tribal assertions during the colonial time, especially in Western India. He has used ethnographic and archival sources to analyze the movements of Western India to promote the subaltern studies in India. He has studied the famous Devi movement which took place in Gujarat during 1920-23. It was Adivasi tribal movement by tribal peasants against the moneylenders, landlords and liquor shop owners. Babasaheb Ambedkar was one of the most dominant political thinkers of India who critically looked at the caste system in India and its rigidity. He took up the issues of Dalits and Adivasi subalterns. For Babasaheb, inequality is a social condition where the social status is given, it is predetermined and achieved by birth into the caste and cannot be changed except by non-ascribed, that is achievement based changes. Such a graded system leaves little or no scope or option for change in the ascribed status. They have no option to fight the oppressive reality of the caste system, although changes are taking place, but the structural change, that is change in the caste status, cannot take place unless the caste system is abolished and there is a casteless society. Subaltern perspective on development should focus on these aspects: inclusive and equitable economic growth, protecting environment and human rights, public participation in decision making. Let us now discuss about the feminist perspective on development. Patriarchy and economic systems propagate oppression. Women have limited role in decision making and thus their needs, concerns and perspectives are not taken into account. Overwhelming household tasks, cultural norms and traditional attitudes limit women's involvement in training programs and other development activities. Women are treated as instruments to achieve goals without appreciating their perspective. Many women identify feminism with specific issues that may or may not include them, rather than with a theory of self-worth that applies to every woman's life without exception. Feminism should mean, on an overarching level, nothing more complicated than women's willingness to act politically to get what they determine that they need. A broad definition of feminism is an awareness of women's oppression and exploitation in society, at work and within family, and conscious action by men and women to change this situation. Class, race and culture are also powerful determinants and therefore create differences that need to be taken into account. Development approaches should consider difference amongst women influenced by many factors like class, caste, socialization process and its manifestation in their lives. There are diverse feminist theoretical approaches. Although they converge on the core issue of women's subordination, they differ in their assumptions about the causes or sources of that subordination. These differences reflect the richness of women's lives and the need to integrate the experiences and knowledge of women across the globe and a move towards a more inclusive, sensitive, theorizing about both women's subordination and their power. The traditional Marxism stated that class was the prime factor in the oppression of working people and that gender equality would follow upon the abolition of class society. Radical feminists argued that making gender equality secondary to class equality diminished the importance of and deferred action on women's concerns. Radical feminists insist that women's subordination does not depend on other forms of domination such as class. They argue that patriarchy or the domination of women by men is primary and existed in virtually every known society, even those without classes. Women's subordination, as it is deeply embedded in individual psyche and social practices, is more difficult to change rather than class. The socialist feminism emerged in second half of the 1970s. Socialist feminists argued that class and women's subordination were of equal importance and had to be challenged simultaneously. Socialist feminists redefined the radical feminist conception of patriarchy so that it meant a set of hierarchical relations with a material base in men's control over women's sexuality, procreation and labor power. They aided on historical dimension of the concept of patriarchy, arguing that it takes different forms in different historical periods and in different racial, cultural, political, economic and religious contexts. When we talk about the eco-feminist perspective, which is also referred to as women, environment and development perspective, holds that there is a natural link between women and environment as both are involved in creation of life. The mainstream post-colonial development characterized by capitalism and patriarchy exploited both nature and women's labor. As a result of this linkage and dual exploitation, women have a greater interest in ending domination over nature and their own lives. Eco-feminists see the patriarchal dominance of women by men as prototype of all domination and exploitation in various hierarchical, militaristic, capitalist and industrialist forms. They point out that the exploitation of nature in particular has gone hand in hand with that of women, and the ancient association of women with and nature links women's history and the history of the environment, and it is the source of natural kinship between feminism and ecology. Accordingly, eco-feminists see female experiential knowledge as a major source for an ecological vision of reality. For instance, the 𝗳𝗏𝗀 movement in India signified peasant women's role in the ecological struggle while going against the so-called mainstream development. Women's direct action of hugging trees to prevent their logging by the commercial firms express the gender difference in the field of ecological concern. Vandana Shiva argues that as the movement developed, it exposed the gender differences in the approach to development within the local communities. While men wanted to create local commercial development by planting trees, women wanted to maintain and plant trees for fuel, wood and fodder. It was at this point, Vandana Shiva argues, that the 𝗳𝗏𝗀 movement became ecological and feminist. The eco-feminist theory has brought into focus the question of how do the dominant development model neglects the concerns of women and nature. On an international platform, ecofeminism allows feminist intervention into development studies. When we talk about post-colonial feminism, it is also known as the third world feminism, draws on post-colonialism, which deliberates the experiences undergone during colonialism, including migration, slavery, overpowering, resistance, representation, difference, race, gender, place and responses to the influential discourses of imperial Europe. The post-colonial feminism focuses on racism, ethnic issues and the long-lasting economic, political and cultural effects of colonialism, inextricably bound up with the unique gendered realities of non-white, non-Western women. When we talk about cultural feminism, it celebrated the role of women as nurturer and caregiver. Protagonists of cultural feminism defended women's position as closer to nature vis-a-vis men who are alienated from nature. Cultural feminism was much supported by Indian feminists like Vandana Shiva for celebrating the closer link between women's body and the ecology. Global feminism celebrates difference without abandoning the search for common political and intellectual agendas. Danish economist 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 in 1970 in her book Women's Role in Economic Development criticized development as being a system that excluded women. She proposed a break with a series of dogmas established in development discourse and policies. She used some empirical research in Africa to question the outcomes of post-1945 development programs, showing that they had serious implications for women's participation and well-being. Until the 1970s, women had only been included in development policies as passive beneficiaries or mothers and housewives, while training, technology and finance were geared to men. The Western model became widespread through development programs and the focus on the home as a standard recipient unit, and particularly on men as breadwinners with a salaried job. Women were dependents in charge of the home. The model ignored the fact that in many cultures, women worked in agriculture and food production, for example, and that there were different or much more flexible sexual division of labor. It also ignored the fact that home or the household was a mesh of power relations that did not necessarily convert the aid given to male breadwinners into profit for the dependents of the other sex. There are several other approaches related with women and development which has contributed in strengthening of feminist perspective. The concept of women in development (WID) facilitated in establishment of NGOs to help women access funds earmarked for development and be included as program beneficiaries. This concept of WID also argued that women, because they are socialized as carers, which involves a greater sense of responsibility to others, would be better resource administrators, better savers, and they were even considered as so far unexploited resource for greater efficiency in development. Another approach, Women and Development (WAD), which emerged in second half of 1970s as a response to the constraints of modernism. This has its roots in Marxist feminism and the theory of dependence, which see the development of the North as the fruit of the exploitation of the South. The WAD approach is more analytical than the WID concept, but does not make concrete proposals for development policies, unlike the WID. The WAD focus hardly analyzes gender relations within social classes and pays little attention to gender subordination, which is true of Marxism in general, and putting greater emphasis on unequal class structure and oppressive international structures. It stresses productive work at the expense of women's reproductive work. Like WID, WAD focused on income generation for women without considering what this meant for them in terms of double day work. As a result, this feminist theory about development, just like the androcentric theories of dependence, modernity and the political economy, saw caring work as part of the private domain, which does not produce value and hence is beyond the purposes of development. Men were in the domain of production and salaried work, while women were in the domain of reproduction. This gap began to close in 1980s with the approach known as Gender and Development (GAD). This new current of thought has its roots in a socialist feminism and in the post-structuralist critique. Socialist feminists challenged capitalism and the patriarchy at the same time and succeeded in closing the flawed debate about the secondary contradiction within the left. They identified the socially constructed division between productive and reproductive work as the basis of the oppression of women and laid the foundations for left-wing feminist economics. GAD is a constructivist approach which starts from a comprehensive perspective. It looks at the whole of the political, economic and social organization of society. GAD does not place women at the center of its analysis, but questions the assumption that women are a homogeneous social category. It stresses that both genders are social constructs beyond biological sex and that women are shaped not only by gender but by other categories of domination such as ethnic and cultural origin, their sexual orientation and age. Feminism has spearheaded the change process by critiquing the process of knowledge acquisition and challenge the hegemony or domination of men's experience in the social institutions. The feministic perspective of development also reflects several phases. The first phase feminism emerged in 19th century, and feminists demanded inclusion of women in the public sphere by giving women their right to vote. The second phase feminism. During this phase, the feminist movement from the 1960s up to early 1980s highlighted the notion personal is political. They argued for women's equal access to public life in the domains of education, paid work and contraceptive technologies. Women's movement in India had reference to second wave feminism of the West. Women's movement in India revisited the social institutions of caste, class, religion and family from a feminist perspective. The third phase feminism emerged in 1980s to challenge the dominant nature of white Western feminism and demanded the intersection between gender, race, class, ethnic identity and sexuality. These three feminist waves had inherent implications for social change by challenging the existing social institutions such as class, race, caste, education, family, marriage and political establishments which were inherently patriarchal in nature. Within these feminist waves, various forms of feminist discourses developed and looked at social change from a feminist theoretical lens. Moreover, different types of feminism believed in empowering women as agents of social change. Carolyn Moser in 1991 developed a differentiated gender planning model for development programs and projects which distinguish between women's practical and strategic needs. This was widely circulated. Practical needs include access to basic services like food, etc., while strategic needs are those that question the subordination in the gender system depending on the specific social context. They may include demands for equal pay for equal work or against gender violence or proposing that women may freely decide over their sexuality and the number of children they have. Moser's model has the advantage of obtaining more complex data to describe a specific context where programs are planned. This focus was officially adopted by major international organizations like United Nations and the World Bank. The feminist perspective in India can be understood in the context of history of colonialism and emergent Indian nationalism, its subsequent advance within the course of independent India's state-initiated development, more recently within the transformed context of globalization and India's own success story in it and growing assertion of marginalized castes. With the growing digital technology, we are seeing emergence of cyber feminists who use digital platforms to fight the challenges emerging out of hardcore patriarchy. To sum up, we can say that the subaltern perspective of development emphasizes on the inclusion of marginalized communities into the mainstream path of development, without which development process is incomplete. The feminist perspective, on the other hand, often focuses on analyzing gender inequality. Themes often explored in feminist theory include discrimination, objectification, especially sexual objectification, oppression, patriarchy, stereotyping, art history, and contemporary art and aesthetics.